All right. Welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. And for the first time in the history of the show, I have read it eventually. I have just finished reading, 2 weeks ago, just finished reading a book on my e-reader. And I genuinely almost went back to my office a minute ago to print out a color paper of the copy or the cover of this because I could not get it to show me a color cover. But then I just realized I could Google it. So I Googled it. The book that I read is called Wesley and the Anglicans, Political Division in Early Evangelicalism. Because when you start a YouTube channel with broad appeal to all kinds of people, the best thing you can do is get hyper specific really, really fast about something like church schism, because that's not going to drive anybody away and is a recipe for success. But as I said in one of the earlier videos, I'm doing this because I want to, and this is the book I feel like talking about because, well, it is hyper-specific, and I'm not necessarily going to recommend that just anybody read Wesley and the Anglicans. What I will say about it, and this is why I rated it 5 stars out of 5, it is an excellent book that made me genuinely sad. Because of its implications. To understand what's going on in this book, it's by Ryan Nicholas Danker, who's a historian of Methodism and Anglicanism. And to understand what's going on in the book, to understand what he's even trying to do, couple real quick historical terms that you have to understand so that anything I'm about to say makes any sense at all. Number one, you have to know what the Anglican Church is. The Anglican Church is the established church of England, actually still is the established church of England, that came out of the Reformation. Henry VIII wanted to have an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He was a Catholic at the time. The Pope wouldn't grant the annulment. And so in the spirit of the Protestant Reformation, Henry was like, well, everybody else seems to be starting a church. What if I started a church, not for Christian renewal, but so that I could have a kid who can carry on my family line? And so that's what he did. And famously, several of his next couple of wives ended up dead. And Lady Jane Grey ended up a saint in Anglicanism, which is bonkers. But anyway, you have to know what Anglicanism is in order to read this book, because he assumes a lot of information in your head. The other thing you have to understand, and he does a pretty good job of sort of unpacking this idea, is you have to understand what Methodism is. And he points out that Methodism in the sort of early to late 1700s is this amorphous movement, partly within the Anglican Church and partly outside of it, that is pushing for sort of a genuine renewal of Christian spirituality, right? And they are called Methodists because they have this very distinct way of doing things, right? Primarily small group meetings, they're called bands, and a very hardcore insistence on actually pursuing what they will call Christian perfection. And so you've got on one side a group of people who are like, let's pursue spiritual renewal in the church and out of it. Let's just go for it, right? Established church or not, let's just go for it. And then you've got a group that Danker calls evangelicals. And evangelicals in his book are specifically Anglican priests and clergymen who want to seek that spiritual renewal, right? But insist that it be done within the confines of the Anglican Church, right? So any kind of weird practice or any sort of thing that's going to make them challenge the status quo, they're not a fan of, because it's going to jeopardize the established church. And the last time, so this is the 1700s, the last time in English history that someone had challenged the established church was the 1630s. And in the 1630s, Puritans, the Pilgrims, those kind of people, challenged the established church in England and the established government. They challenged everything, honestly. And the result was a civil war that lasted for over a decade, and Charles I, the King of England, being beheaded by his own subjects. And so that's the context in which John Wesley has his very famous evangelical conversion at Aldersgate, where he says, my heart was strangely warmed in hearing about Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians, I think it was. And he has this evangelical conversion, bunch of people having those at this time period. And what Danker wants to do in this book is explain why Wesley, who was an ordained Anglican clergyman, okay, so he's an Anglican priest, he wants to explain how it is that John Wesley and those who followed him exited the Anglican Church. Because Wesley's an Anglican clergyman, you would think, oh, great, he wants to stay within the church. Okay, do spiritual renewal from within the church, just like these other guys. And Danker gives this whole list of names. I'm not going to give you any of them because I didn't know who they were before reading the book, and I know a little bit about a little bit more about them now, but you'll be fine without knowing their names. And so you would think Wesley would want to be part of that, but ultimately Danker paints this picture, and I don't know that he intended to do this, but from the outside looking in, when I saw the picture that he paints of John Wesley, I call him Wesley the Waffler. And again, I want to be clear, I don't know that you get a full-orbed picture of Wesley in this book. John Wesley's a great guy, cared about evangelical conversion, cared about the actual living out of the Christian life, and so, I don't want to cast a bunch of aspersions. But what I see in this book is you've got a John Wesley who, on the one hand, has this massive desire for enthusiastic renewal of the Christian life, right? And that's what prompts his conversion, because he's a missionary in Georgia to the Native Americans and the colonists there. And he's talking to these Moravians who are also there as missionaries. And he basically tells one of them, I don't even really know if I think that I'm saved. I'm a Christian because I was baptized as an infant, but I don't even know if I'm genuinely a Christian or if I'm just a baptized infant, essentially. And so the Moravians are like, well, do you have assurance of your salvation? He's like, no. And they're like, oh, yeah, you should probably work on that then, because that's kind of how you know. And so you get Wesley, who on the one hand is like Aldersgate experience, evangelical conversion, a coming to Jesus moment. And he's all about that. And he insists at the same time, I am a high churchman, right? I'm committed to the Anglican hierarchy. But then he evinces in the book this serious unwillingness to suffer any kind of institutional constraint. When he starts up his Methodist movement, he starts sending lay preachers everywhere. People who are not ordained, people who have received no theological education. He basically says at one point in the book, there's a quote that I'm paraphrasing here. He says, they've received an education in the receipt of grace, and that's enough, right? And so he sends these guys out into the parishes, right, the places of work and business of Anglican clergymen who are like, hey, you can't do field preaching unless you are a licensed clergyman. You can't offer the sacraments unless you're a licensed clergyman. You can't do the church things unless you are a member of the church, right? A member of the licensed hierarchy of the church. And Wesley, in one breath in this book, will say, oh yeah, I totally agree with that, 100%. And then in the next, will be like, yeah, but I also just really like sending lay preachers to places, and they agree with me. And so out they go, even though they're going to, horn in on your territory and start doing a different, parallel service that your parishioners are going to leave your service to go to. And they're maybe going to offer the sacraments, even though they're not supposed to do that. And Wesley says they're not supposed to offer the sacraments. I told them not to do that. But then at the same time, Wesley is not able to get them to stop, right? So he'll say oh, I don't want them to do X, Y, and Z. But then he doesn't have enough control over the Methodist movement to actually get them to cease their weird behaviors. And so it's really unfortunate because ultimately Wesley's theological movement turns into a bit of a hodgepodge. Okay, Methodism turns into a bit of a hodgepodge. And then that results in something that I think we actually see still happening today, which is this legacy of schism, right? So there's this quote that Danker uses in this book from a historian called Henry Rack. And Rack says in his book, The Reasonable Enthusiast, which is a life of Wesley, he claims Wesley's conversion was a failed attempt to become a Moravian, talking about the Aldersgate experience. He writes, Wesley's failure to become a high church Pharisee and his failure to become a successful working mystic and Indian missionary, talking about his time in Georgia, is followed by a failure to undergo a Moravian conversion. In the event, this was no great loss, since it is impossible to imagine John Wesley and Count von Zinzendorf cooperating in the same religious community for very long. And then Danker goes on and says, the marks of these failed conversions appear in Wesley's theological works and practical endeavors throughout his life. The amalgamation of high church Anglicanism, pietism, which is evangelical conversion kind of stuff, and evangelical elements within Wesley would often put him at odds with each of these groups. So you get a Wesley in this book who is like 4 slices of 4 different pies stuck together, but none of them have been baked all the way through. And again, I don't know enough about John Wesley to just say, yeah, that's accurate, or yeah, that's not accurate. It seems like it's at least a little bit accurate, right? This is a really well-researched book. There's a ton of footnotes. He's clearly read thousands of pages in order to write this book that's only 250 pages, 280 pages long. But you get a Wesley who, at times, it just doesn't seem like he knows what he wants. And the result of that is a Wesley who seems unwilling or unable to control the Methodist movement, which is why these evangelical Anglicans, who want the same kind of spiritual renewal he does, but insist that it come through the church, are like, yeah, we got to part ways with this guy. We can't do this. We can't be with him, right? You can't preach in our pulpits. You can't spend your time in our churches. We're not going to host your small groups. We're not going to let your lay preachers come into our parishes. Absolutely not, right? No close association between us. And ultimately what I see in the book is this legacy of schism. I had to write a paper about this. This is a book I read for seminary. And this is what I said about it. What you see in this book. Wesley split with the Moravians over whether or not people were really saved. And then with the Methodist Calvinists over Calvinism. He split with Anglican evangelicals over a variety of issues, including communion and lay preaching and all this other stuff. And then his ordination of overseeing Methodist clergy for North America, so he ordained bishops for North America, which is something he was not, as a priest, not able to do, but he did it anyway. That led him to split with his own brother, Charles Wesley, and they never reconciled. They basically stopped speaking to one another after that, and then they both died shortly thereafter. Then Methodism parted ways with Anglicanism generally. They became 2 different communions, right? 2 different churches. The Methodist movement in America just maintained this spirit of sort of enthusiastic purity over everything else. And the result was just more schism. I don't have the time or the wherewithal to go into all the splits, but there's splits between Northern and Southern Methodists, which is legitimate. It was over slavery, so legitimate split, but still a split. Between white and black Methodists over segregation and slavery. Between those with varying views on Christian perfection, right? Whether or not you can become what Wesley called entirely sanctified. And that spirit of schism continues into the modern day. Because especially that debate over Christian perfection, that produces Pentecostalism. That produces the Salvation Army. That produces the denomination of the church that I currently go to, which is the Christian and Missionary Alliance. It produces Free Methodism, which has nothing to do with Methodism other than the name and some of the practices. And so you just get this massive schism, or massive set of schisms, and that continues into the modern day, where you have the United Methodist Church splitting from, the Global Methodist Church splitting from the United Methodist Church over both human sexuality, but also over whether or not God is Trinitarian, which is something that is up for debate in particularly West Coast United Methodism. And so, like I said, this is a book that I thought was really good. I gave it 5 stars out of 5 stars. I thought it was super interesting. Devoured it. Thought it was great. Didn't hate writing a paper about it, which is saying something, because I really don't care for writing papers most of the time. But it, honestly, at the end of the day, it kind of hurt my heart, because I guess honestly, would it not have been better? Would Anglicanism not have been better? Would Methodism not have been better? Would Christianity generally not have been better if John Wesley had taken the advice of the Anglican evangelicals, including his own brother Charles, who said, listen, buddy, we got to run a tight ship. We got to stop letting people just run roughshod over the rules. And we need to maintain the unity and coherence of the church so that we can preserve its witness. And I'm really convinced that that would have been better. Because today, you've got 7 or 8 major Methodist denominations, right? Wesleyan denominations. Well, Methodist denominations. And then you've got an even broader family of Wesleyan denominations. Again, including the church that I go to is actually Wesleyan. It's a holiness movement church. And then you've got splits within Anglicanism itself, right? And so this isn't to throw stones at John Wesley, because Anglicanism has plenty of its own problems. But it, like I said, it hurt my heart, because I really wished that things had gone differently. And I think it would have been better for all concerned. So that's my hyper-specific dive into church schism in the 1700s, specifically for Methodism. I read it. I enjoyed it. It made me sad. Probably not going to read it again. But if you're a Methodist, or if you're an Anglican, or if you care about those things, highly recommend that you take a look at Wesley and the Anglicans by Ryan Nicholas Danker. It's a good book. And if nothing else, it will challenge you in your thinking. So, till next time, I suppose. Go read something.